We're back, folks. Welcome back. This is Chance here with Apocalypsis Historia. Back with Brady. We're doing an old-fashioned podcast. This is a live stream that we did back at the end of June. But if you guys remember, it was a stormy little summer. And because the storm was going so bad, our live stream got cut off. It didn't get put up on YouTube. So we're re-recording this here. Hope it's a good one. What we're going to talk about tonight: Philip Sidney, our favorite guy on the planet. We're going to talk about defensive poetry and maybe go into why people still aren't understanding Sidney at a deeper level. There's a little too much surface level reading of Philip Sidney happening, and so we're going to go look at maybe several essays, but one in particular from the 1970s by a man named Ronald Lavao, and it's called Sidney's Feigned Apology. And it is going to go into detail on what Philip Sidney's mindset actually is and his viewpoints actually are from the defensive poetry. So stay tuned. Give us a like, give us a subscribe, comment if anything we say sounds interesting. Otherwise, let's dive into Sidney here.
Yeah, profane litmus test here.
Yeah.
Because as we always talk about, that there's always the extra layer to Sidney that a lot of us are probably not reading it correctly, and we are met with ad nauseum Sidney must have not written plays because he doesn't like this or he says that. And I think that maybe even if you go back and watch our defensive poetry videos, maybe we're sort of even giving it a surface level reading.
Yeah, we're still dancing around it. And
we're being profane wits at that point.
We were then, and maybe we still are a little bit now, but we're trying to get deeper every day. Yeah, and shout out to Ron Roffel, shout out to Floating Homes, shout out to 6 Days Theater, shout out to Context Shakespeare, and you Oxfordians that are, digging our channel, but maybe still a little confused on how to apply Sidney, what Sidney's role could or would be. This may help a little bit. For you guys that still seriously doubt Sidney, this is our attempt to maybe make it make more sense for you. Okay, so just real quick context. This is an essay going over Sidney's apology for poetry, aka defensive poetry. It gets called DOP and a lot of stuff. I usually use the DOP shorthand, but apology for poetry. Ronald Lavao is like super sharp dude. Like reading Ronald Lavao is itself its own task. He's very recursive, almost enigmatic, constantly referring to very deep, complex Renaissance ideas. He has several awesome essays about Bacon as well, and he has one essay that maybe talks about the difference between Sidney and Bacon's philosophies, and that's about the coolest essay there is. But this one in particular is him trying to guide us through defensive poetry, aka apology for poetry, because the surface level reading, especially if you talk to any Oxfordians or even Stratfordians, the surface level readings that Sidney's kind of this very erudite, elitist kind of guy that doesn't dig, public plays, and he thinks that the regular theater going public's a bunch of lowbrow stuff, and they're doing all sorts of
nose.
Snub at his nose. All of that's too silly. They're mixing all this stuff. They're not following the Greek unities, and because of that, he says, "Look, there's only really been one good play written in English, and that's Gorboduc, and that was written back in '69, and he's writing this in '81." So he says, in the last 12 years, there's been one good play written, and then since then, nothing. That is pretty critical. And so a lot of people are like, oh, he must have just hated plays. No way that he could be any part of Shakespeare or it all interests.
Shakespeare breaks all these rules, and Sidney says you can't break those rules.
Yeah,
and so Sidney must not be on board with that whole project or scene.
Which, you know, if y'all have watched some of our other videos, we have Sidney's Defense of Poetry, Part 1, Part 2, and then we have Shakespeare in Arcadia, going over Alwyn Thaler's book, which we'll also reference here today. But Alwyn Thaler was a Shakespeare scholar, actual Orthodox scholar, and he said, whoa, there's a ton of Sidney in Shakespeare, and if we just look at the Defense of Poetry, we'll see that Shakespeare's almost seemingly responding to Sidney at every level. And indeed, Oxfordians sort of pitch that, but they want to kind of twist it into this, and I would argue a corrupted version, where it's like they think that Oxford's just looking down on Sidney and spoofing him at every turn, and that you know, this is all coming from the idea that the two are super hostile towards each other, and it's exacerbated by Charlton Ogburn's book, where Ogburn and Ogburn's wife both say, look, Sidney's super overrated, he's not that great, the government's really propping him up, his sister's really propping him up, he's, you know, really not that talented of a poet, and a lot of Oxfordians eat that up wholesale, which is silly, but because of that, we now have to undo some of that here. And, you know, to be fair, Ronald Lavao wrote this essay before Ogburns wrote their book. So, you know, just going to say, like, people understood Sidney before those Ogburns came around. I won't use any pejoratives here. It'll be nice. But, yeah, we got to undo some of that. So let's look at Lavao here. Okay, so we'll skip through some stuff and we'll hop and jump, but we'll try to make sure that we hit all the beat points and not keep this too long. But it starts by saying, look, any attempt to discuss Sidney's theory of poetic fictions proves to be something of a paradox. And if you haven't gotten to the paradox, you weren't looking very hard. So just already starting off, Lavao's already way past where everybody's at, so we might have to do some backtracking as we go along. Because, as far as I can tell, none of these Sidney naysayers have realized that defensive poetry is filled with contradictions and paradox. Everybody, like I said, reads it at the surface level that, oh, he totally sides with, you know, Aristotle. He's against all these other, you know, new kind of loose ways of mixing comedy and tragedy and following the unities and all that. Like, no. We'll see through this essay that Sidney is constantly making a claim, then undercutting that claim. And when that happens, we have to sit there and wade through, well, what is he actually saying? Because we have some paradoxes, and working through the paradox is what Sidney wants us to do. So, little spoiler alert, that's kind of the main theme of this. Okay, so Sidney compares himself to his master in horsemanship, which, yeah, Sidney loves his horses, Gian Pietro Pugliano, who, cannot content to teach young students the practical side of his profession, sought to enrich their minds with the contemplations therein. And we'll skip down a little bit. Sidney opens with a theoretical justification of his own vocation, poetry. But with such a precedent, readers may wonder whether Sidney will persuade them to wish themselves poems, which, in fact, where Sidney's Astrophil ends up in Sonnet 45 of Astrophil and Estella. So, if the opening of the apology is not paradoxical enough, the apology itself is filled with contradictions and shifts of emphasis. Despite these, it does make certain significant gestures towards theorizing. So Lavao says, I argue that Sidney's readers have long mistaken his intellectual affinities because of the oblique and self-conscious way he echoes traditional philosophical and critical positions. But a closer view of his performance will, I think, reveal the apology as one of the most daring documents of Renaissance criticism, in keeping with the most original thought of its time. So yeah, this isn't just some generic review where some guy's just ripping on stuff for 40 pages. Sidney's theorizing, undercutting that theorizing, and doing theorizing through that undercutting of that original theorizing.
It's like, yeah, really, and I've kind of said this on the Buckridge episode, and it's just being able to read that one layer deeper, essentially, you know? And I know that sort of, our holster's already sort of smoking here. We're already shooting off, shots already been fired here, I feel like. This podcast for sure. But yeah, it's like, and it's this sort of thing about being like, aha, Oxford is Othello. That's, you know, that's our stand-in. And then us going like, do you want Oxford to be Othello? If you really read into like what the character of Othello does, like, and, you know, he gets kind of clowned around. Like, is that really is that the stance you really want to take?
Right.
If you choose that reading, right?
Like let's be as,
for instance,
and that's an excellent point, because that's something that I've been sort of going back and forth with some Oxfordians on, that, like, you know, the old Buckridge point, just because we see some reference to Oxford, does that mean that Oxford's the writer?
Yeah. And look, Sidney said he doesn't like
this
and
you know,
that.
flip side, you know, just because we have some reference to Sidney doesn't mean that Sidney's the writer either. But if we do have references to Sidney, and those references aren't necessarily pejorative, maybe we need to rethink this whole, like, 100% lampooning idea. But let's continue.
And what's nice also to sort of boast up that argument too is that we already have Sidney in his own writing clowning himself, making fun of himself. Yeah. So even if you see him in a Shakespeare thing, like an Ague Cheeks sort of thing, it's like it's part of his it's part of his shtick. I'm pretty sure he's fine doing that apparently. But anyways, at least there's precedence for it.
And you know, and if you don't buy that line of thought, just wait. That's kind of a big part of Lavao's claim, is that Sidney is going to be very self-effacing, self-defaming even, very satirical towards his own stance. So Sidney's purpose seems obvious enough: to justify poetic fictions against the charge that they are unreal and irresponsible fantasies. And this is, you know, in response to Stephen Gosson's essay that attacked poetry in the theaters, which Gosson, fun fact, dedicated to Philip Sidney. Yeah. For the sake of clarity, I begin by dividing my examination into two parts, following the line drawn by Sidney's own argument. And so it says, any understanding knoweth the skill of the artificer, and this is Sidney's own words, standeth in that idea or foreconceit of the work, and not in the work itself. And that the poet hath that idea is manifest, by delivering them forth in such excellency as he hath imagined them. Which delivering forth also is not wholly imaginative, as we are wont to say by them that builds castles in the air. But so far substantially it worketh, not only to make a Cyrus, which had been a particular excellency as nature might have done, but to bestow a Cyrus upon the world, to make many Cyruses, if they will learn aright why and how that maker made him. So what is striking about this defense is that Sidney seeks to justify poetry by turning toward the two extremes. The two extremes it meditates, or mediates. First, to its source in the poet's idea, so the, you know, formation, the conceit, the concept, and then to the moral effect it has on the reader's world. It becomes a conduit, leading the ideal to flow into the actual. To understand how Sidney puts his argument together, we must take a closer look at these two extremes and their relations. So we basically have the a priori, you know, the reason, the mind, the conceptual, and then we got the a posteriori, you know, the actual experience, the actual effect, the real life reality. And Sidney is trying to merge these ideas. So first, what is the idea or foreconceit? Modern critics are nearly unanimous in pointing to it as an example of the Renaissance Neoplatonism or Augustinianism. The reasons for this are clear. Both traditions help to fulfill a central need for 16th century theorists of the artist idea by giving it a fixed ontological basis. Panofsky's discussion of the revival of Neoplatonism is instructive. The idea was reinvested with its a priori, there's that term, and metaphysical character. The autocratic human mind, now conscious of its own spontaneity, believed that it could maintain the spontaneity in the face of sensory experience only by legitimizing the former subspecie divinitatis, aka the dignity of genius, now explicitly recognized and emphasized, is justified by its origin in God. So Rosamund Tuve thinks that this kind of justification is essential to Renaissance poetic theory, The poet, she argues in her influential Elizabethan and metaphysical imagery, simply has no nervousness dealing overtly with universals. She attributes this confidence to the pervasiveness of Platonic and Neoplatonic conceptions of reality, imitating Plotinus's ideal form and order. As Christeller has previously noted for the Neoplatonists, the true poet does not follow the arbitrary impulse of human thought, but is inspired by God. So Sidney seems to need this justification as much as any other theorist. Like the boldest Neoplatonist before him, he praises the poet as a free creator lifted up with the vigor of his own invention. There's that word, invention. Freely ranging only within the zodiac of his own wit. And, guys, you know, just saying right now, like, what a writer. Freely ranging within the zodiac of his own wit. If you don't think that a guy that writes a line like that is capable of Shakespeare, then, you know, I'd like to hear why. He is free of nature and of any given subject matter. He does not derive conceit out of a matter, but maketh a matter for a conceit. And so, yeah, this is somebody that has the idea first, and then puts together the characters, the words, the themes, the settings, all that stuff, adds it in after this sort of Platonic form or this Platonic idea has been conceived. But in the Apology, Sidney tends to regard the Platonic Augustinian argument would afford as part of a voice that he self-consciously affects, a voice he asks us to think about critically, even as he uses it to provide terms for the poet's creativity. So, while it seemingly is praising this thing, he is himself sort of being this person, right? Like, he's saying, oh, the poet's this great person that ranges within the zodiac of his own wit. Well, he is the poet writing this essay, and while he's, using his own words and ranging with the zodiac of his own wit, whose arguments is he putting forth? Plato, Aristotle. They're not his arguments. And so he's already undercutting that stance of the poet as this pure creator, divine creator. But wait, isn't that what he's all about? Why would he undercut that? Paradox. Sidney's discussion of poetic inspiration, for example, is deliberately tangled and ambivalent. He starts by examining the Roman term poet vates. He translates this heavenly title as diviner, foreseer, or prophet, and says that the Romans attributed the power of prophecy to Virgil. Sidney then gives us two contradictory reactions to this information. First, he condemns the Romans for their vain and godless superstition. And then he tells us they were altogether not without ground. Wait, what? So, those idiots, vain, godless superstition, but they had a point. Which goes right back to our Sidney D. Epic podcast, our epic 4-hour podcast, where Philip Sidney makes the comments to Hubert Langett that, hey, you better not keep making fun of D or he's going to wield his Monas Hieroglyphica at you. And, you know, people that read surface level Sidney are like, oh, that must mean Sidney doesn't agree with D's Monas Hieroglyphica. But no, it's this exact thing where, that's vain and godless superstition, but it's not without ground. And so, it was tongue-in-cheek when Sidney wrote it to Langett, and that was our initial reading, and sure enough, that's corroborated here. He softens his criticisms because that same exquisite observing of number and measure in words and that high-flying liberty of conceit proper to the poet did seem to have some divine force in it. The poet then is not really inspired. His heavenly and divine nature is at best metaphorical. It is an illusion, not illusion, but an understandable one based on verbal artifice and the high-flying liberty of conceit. So the irony is clear. Inspiration is not the cause of the poet's conceit, but the effect that the conceit has on the reader and or the poet. So just want to point that out, that it's not this divine inspiration that boom, oh, the idea came into my mind, oh my god, what's happening. No, it's that you sit there and you mull on the idea, and you look at the idea, and you think about the idea, and when you eventually put that into a text, when the reader is reading it or watching it or whatever, that effect, that idea has been transferred and put into their brain, and that moment where it goes into their brain, like, oh my god, I see this whole... That is the inspiration. That is the divine moment. So already Philip Sidney's he's basically trying to do what Kant does, like, 150 years later, where he's trying to connect the two branches of philosophy. You get, the rationalists, the a priori guys, it's all in the brain, it's all up here, it's all Plato. And then you got, your empiricists, your Bacons, your Humes, that it's all in the observation, it's the reality of the world. And Kant tries to tie those together, and that's why a lot of people still think he's the greatest philosopher of all time. He's the, Mozart of philosophy. Sidney's like trying to do this already, but maybe just specifically through a literary context. That's like already in itself mind-blowing. And like, yeah, like, maybe Sidney's not Shakespeare. Just maybe he's not Shakespeare, but this is like Shakespeare level.
Yeah, this is the scaffold to get there in the English scene. Like, and we've already said it before.
Yeah.
Mainstream academics will say this already. There's no way that Shakespeare was not reading DOP and not taking notes meticulously, being like, oh yeah, I'm gonna have to figure out how to answer that, and like, oh, that would, there's no way that the Shakespeare stuff is not a clear spiritual successor to something like this.
Yeah,
like this critique.
There's a little YouTube video out there, Sidney, Shakespeare's Muse of Fire, and so like that's just from someone that thinks Shakespeare and Sidney, and they think clearly. Oh my God, if you go read Sidney, you realize it's all over Shakespeare, and yeah, just you get that little part highlighted. Number and measure should call to mind measure for measure, right? Which measure for measure is set in where's measure for measure set? Vienna, right? Which Shakespeare authorship candidate ever went to Vienna?
And if we get back to some of this stuff, because it's also in my mind, because he's relating it back to the Vates, the Romans are divine inspiration, and saying that it's not without grounds some of the spookiness, but when he talks about that same exquisite observing of number and measure in words, and that high-flying liberty of conceit proper to the poet did seem to have some divine force in it. It's almost saying like, the power of the words themselves and carefully chosen, crafted, and arranged words does seem to have literally, that divine force in it, in a sense, and harkening back to magic or words as a very magical technology. It goes back to time immemorial, that very much the written word.
What
biblical or not? They're all
like
very much
let's go biblical. What does it say? First there was the word.
Yep. And so and he's and even some of that stuff like you just said about him wanting to combine both the schools of philosophy. So I know Christians would say like, well, that's what Christ is. He's like literally God embodied incarnate and as literal physical manifestation of those ideals or whatever. Or maybe any God man could be sort of a stand-in for that sort of thing or whatever. But yeah, I like getting back to that. The words is very magical process in of itself or whatnot. Especially when you got the whole Vates thing and going back to the root word Vates, going back to Vod and Vat and the frenzy, divine frenzy of the Odin stuff.
Yeah, it gets into like Proto-Indo-European and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So
okay, so where Sidney does mention poets who were truly inspired by God, people like David or Solomon and others, he is careful to set them apart from right poets, his subject. Okay, so already these people that are inspired by God, those aren't right poets. Okay, he makes so many motions in distinguishing these right poets from philosophical and historical poets, those who follow a proposed subject instead of their own invention. and already right there, Sidney's sort of drawing a line, placing fiction over history. Sorry. If we think of something like maybe, trying to think of a movie here that does that, but like,
where it's like a movie like the OK or Tombstone or something, where it's like that's not a very historical movie or whatever. Is that the sort of,
thank you for saying Tombstone, because Warlock's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah.
Like,
is that what you were?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get to, and thank you for bringing up Tombstone. Like, Tombstone is set in Tombstone, and it's, the main character is Wyatt Earp, and like that's the real history. And does it follow history? Probably not, because if it did, it would be dry and boring. It wouldn't be good fiction, right? But even more powerful fiction than the movie Tombstone is maybe not just the movie Warlock, but the novel Warlock, because instead of setting it in Tombstone, Arizona, it's set in Warlock, Arizona. Warlock does not exist. It's completely fictionalized. Instead of it being Wyatt Earp as the sheriff, it's Clay Blaisdell. Clay Blaisdell did not exist. But in using the fiction, it allows him more license to get more ideas across, get more interesting nuances across, because history's a dry thing.
It's weird how it becomes like, if that book does a good job of making you feel like it's authentic and you're on the ground, even though, like you just said, it's clearly fiction and it's clearly taking inspiration from something else, but it also becomes some of that platonicness where they become like these characters are not just like time and place because of the circumstances. It's like, yeah, they are, but then they're somehow fully bloomed out into some of these other philosophical stuff. Like the Doctor kind of stands in for, the guy maybe at the threshold of wanting to lead a revolution.
Right.
Have the Clay Blaisdell's love interest, I don't remember her name, but she's the sort of like, naive feminine sort of character that is the sort of one like, pulling at men's heartstrings and, kind of getting things into trouble because of her own passion.
Right.
But like, there's a lot of like overall like, like platonic.
Jesse.
There you go.
Yeah.
But just, like archetypal stuff that's sort of like embedded, but with this veneer of the Old West and of this like supposedly well-known scene or whatever.
Yeah. And, like, I don't know, clearly Oakley Hall, who wrote Warlock's, trying to play on a lot of collective consciousness and that kind of thing. But I think, that's partly what Sidney's getting at here, is that, look, we have this history already sort of collectively in our heads, going over the dry facts of history. How much more are you going to get out of that? What lessons are we going to learn? What is inspiration will be invoked in us? How will we change? What's the real effect of that? And so while Sidney is interested in history, like clearly he drops all these historical references and allusions. He's clearly obsessed with it. Why does he think that poetry or, poetry about history is better than some actual factual historical, and, to be fair, like our idea of factual historical is not the same as their idea of factual historical. Like, their factual historical has giants like roaming Britain, and, Britain's, directly descended from Troy, and that's not stuff we say anymore. That's not part of the dry historical narrative, and in fact, we've gotten drier and, and drier. And as we've gotten drier and drier, I think that makes our fiction have to do the opposite, equal opposite reaction sort of thing, and our fiction has to do more and more of that Oakley Hall, Philip Sidney, and, I'll give it a shout out here. I don't know if he ever gets referenced. I don't think so. But Thucydides, he's like the original Greek to say, look, yeah, we can go with history, and history's awesome, and that's why I'm going to tell about history, but my spin on history is always going to be a little more awesome than regular history. And it's like, at some point, Sidney's so hyper aware of that spin that he's trying to maybe place that argument that the spin itself is as important as the history, trying to place the poet at the forefront, but also undercutting that. So, I don't know. Let's keep going. So, going along with that idea, Sidney is interested in a poetic grounded entirely in the human mind. Sidney's the ultimate humanist as far as I'm concerned. And, maybe Lavao will argue that Sidney's even a little post-humanist. But I think Lavao pretty much argues that Sidney's the last great humanist, and then after that we get Baconian destroying humanism. Which, maybe explains why I've latched on to Sidney and I haven't yet quite super latched on to Bacon. I'm such a humanist in mindset. That's why I'm an English major, not an engineer. So an inspiration would compromise its autonomy. Interesting. So Sidney's like, look, yeah, God's great and all, and if I got some divine message from God, cool. But doing that takes away from human autonomy. At the end of the day, who is the center of Sidney's world? Yeah, he's as religious as it gets, but it's not God. It's the self. It's the human. It's the John Keats romantic mind. Sidney's already doing it 200 years before the freaking Romantics. Like, that blows my mind. Okay. As Sidney tells us later, Plato in his Ion attributeth unto poetry more than myself do. Okay, so he's distinguishing himself from Plato, saying, look, Plato goes farther than I will. Namely, to be very inspiring of a divine force, far above man's wit. So Sidney's like, look, Plato says that God comes and talks to you and makes it come out you. I don't know that I agree with that. Okay, there's your Protestant right there. Sidney's use of metaphysics can be deceptive. Though he uses it in terms to praise the poet's creativity, he then dismisses them before they can compromise the mind's autonomy. The same pattern recurs immediately after the Vates discussion when Sidney turns to the word poet. It cometh of this word poiein, which is to make in Greek. Sidney's use of Greek etymology, like Landino's, serves as an occasion to praise the poet. And Sidney follows with his famous celebration of poetry's golden world and the poet's creation of a new nature. Sidney then defends his claim. Neither let it be deemed too saucy a comparison to balance the highest point of man's wit with the efficacy of nature. Okay. He's like, look, this isn't blasphemy saying human mind is the center of nature. Like, let's be honest. Look around you. Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff. Waterfalls, cool. Birds flying, neat. Flowers, yeah, they're beautiful. They smell great. But, like, let's be honest. Like, what is it we're all, like, wowed by? We're wowed by what we can do. Stonehenge, the pyramids, Shakespeare. That's the greatest thing in nature. Which, that's not nature, that's human artifice. Sidney's like, what are you doing drawing a line between the two? Aren't we part of nature? And, like, that's already so ahead of its time. That's already so ahead of its time. He's already done what Kant wants to do. But rather give right honor to the heavenly maker of that maker. And so, look, hey, I'm not demeaning God. Who made our minds? I'm not saying I'm better than God. I'm just saying this is the God you're talking about. It's not some other thing. It is us. And it's a very Protestant belief. Who, having made man to his own likeness, set him beyond over all the works of that second nature, which in nothing he showeth so much as in poetry, when with the force of a divine breath he bringeth things forth so far surpassing her doings, with no small argument to the incredulous of that first accursed fall of Adam. Which, alright, hold on, like, this is all one sentence, guys. This is all one. Are you kidding me? Since our erected wit maketh us know what perfection is, and yet our infected will keepeth us from reaching unto it. Wow. So poetry is, in a sense, trying to undo, original sin. Like, that's crazy. Our position
is
is
like, I don't know, like, I'm just getting like hyped up in here because it's just like, yeah, which nothing shows so much as poetry, which with the force of divine breath, and just going back to poetry is just assembled words. Once again, words harkening back to literally a magical effect itself. Yeah. And the divine breath, and just like, I don't know, I sent you something earlier about the Ansus, the old ash rune again, but it's very much when it gets translated from old German and Norse to like an old English context.
Yeah, I was gonna say this is very Anglo-Saxon.
It also gets this etymology connection to or connotation of the mouth or breath itself.
Yep.
Because it not only is the Ansu's Aska thing is all related to like literally just Odin and God itself.
Yeah,
I was gonna also the breath of God.
I was gonna say in Cadman's hymn, it's literally a wind that blows through the barn.
Yeah, and so and one of the things he has, Odin is the thing that gives man life itself through his breath or whatever.
And you know that's a Christianity in Cadman's hymn, like literally just co-opting completely. Yeah.
And so yeah, I just like seeing all these same motifs again. Yeah, poetry is divine words and just filled with divine breath because it is like a divine magical force in of itself. Like kind of like this, words already sort of try to encapsulate and capture something incapturable and sort of indefinable in a sense, but they try as best they can in some ways, right?
Sorry, this is total tangent, but me and my roommate got done doing the whole Indiana Jones trilogy over again, and that was like a really disappointing scene for me that I loved as a kid, but when I rewatched it, his 3 tests. The first test is the breath of God, and it's like it should be some poetry thing, right? Like he should have to recite some crazy cool poetry in Hebrew. No, what does he do? He has to like somersault under like a mower blade or something, and like if he doesn't, his head comes off, and it's like not very poetic. Come on, Spielberg. Come on, Lucas. What are y'all doing? Kazdan, whoever's right now. So our position in the universe is a gift of God, and we are fitted into a hierarchical series of makers, beginning with God, who surpasses us in nature, which we surpass. But if the gift explains our capacity, it does not control our use of it or bind it to the fixed order of things. So after the Vatsas argument, the divine breath must be metaphorical, referring to our own efforts to bring forth our own creations. We are the divine breath. That's what words, that's what language is. It's,
right. It's nothing but, you're literally just breathing out and just making some sounds as you do.
Yep. Okay. Perhaps echoing Scaliger's claims that man transforms himself into a second deity. We reveal our divinity through our own effort. Okay, but, this is all Sidney's claims, but at the same time, this is still Sidney kind of recapitulating Plato, recapitulating Scaliger. So let's see where this goes. But more important, there's no clear transition from the mind's operations to its transcendental source. Thank you. Sidney's highest point of man's wit is not a mystical apex mentis directly sparked by the divine. It is the faculty that creates fictions, the faculty that creates another nature, and so reveals our divinity to ourselves. Okay, so we've got this sort of idea set up that Sidney's posturing to put the poets ahead of the historians, ahead of the philosophers. Those are both great things, but as far as the most effective thing, and so he's already postured, so it's all about the effect. But so far, what has he talked about? He hasn't talked about any of the effects. He's talked about all the formation of it. And so we're still in this a priori Platonic thing, but as we go on, it's going to become more and more about the effect. And as it becomes more and more about the effect, that's when things will start to get more and more undercut. So let's see. Skipping ahead a little.
Even building up to this point, like, I don't know, it's still just, it's so compelling.
It's already so cool.
Even though you don't even realize, I guess, that he's still cutting the floor out from beneath you or whatever.
Yeah, but this is one cool floor.
Once again, just hitting at that same thing about, where he talks about poet and poesia, meaning, to a meaning maker itself, and the maker has such, sort of heavy theological tone to it already, but now we're spinning it and sort of entering this sort of what we wouldn't, poetry and fiction, that's not, divine inspiration or text or that sort of thing.
That's just silly fancy.
It's fun, to see this convergence, and maybe this is it's all just Greek, man. It all just goes back to Greeks coming up with all this stuff in the beginning anyway. But
let me go. Furthermore, the above quotation on the hierarchy of makers is a defense of one possible metaphor and an attempt to show that it is not too saucy. After his magnificent praise of the erected wit, Sidney tells us, But these arguments will be by few understood. Okay, too many of my YouTube transactions have proven that true. And by fewer...
I'm flashing across the screen right now.
I won't do that to y'all. And by fewer granted. Thus much I hope will be given me, that the Greeks with some probability of reason gave the name above all names of learning. So all of a sudden, all these things that have been sort of pitched as his claim, he's now like sort of distancing himself while still agreeing, saying, look, I hope you know, buy these arguments, because that's what the Greeks said. That's what the Greeks said. And so while he's making you agree with him, he's also distancing himself from making that his claim. He's pointing, this is their claim, and I just happen to agree with it. All is suddenly qualified as Sidney reminds us that this passage is part of a voice he has assumed for the sake of a few debatable arguments. This is all a rhetorical device. Is this what he believes? Maybe, maybe not. He's just trying to make you agree with him. He's not concerned with establishing their objective validity, and he neither affirms nor denies them. He is satisfied with showing that at best they point to some probability of reason. Indeed, the entire argument for the poet as a maker is not so much a justification as justification of wit, is a demonstration of wit. It is a bold comparison, which according to Aristotle and Renaissance rhetoricians, is a prime way of exhibiting wit. So he's using an example, you know, form meets function sort of thing here. So if the poet is lifted up with the vigor of his own invention, so too is the reader. Poetry is the best teacher, the first light giver to ignorance, and the first study to show us a pleasure in the exercises of the mind. The separation of the idea from a fixed ontology, moreover, makes poetry a special kind of exercise. So in a fascinating article, A.E. Malik argues that for Sidney, it is only in poetry that reason finds an object properly proportioned to its capacities. But Malik sees this in a Thomist light. The fallen world is deficient, while poetry's golden world reveals a fullness of being, which fully actualizes the act of cognition. I, Ronald Lavao, would argue on the contrary, that the poetic object is best proportioned to our reason because that object is a projection of our reason. So, poetry is not best because we're reaching towards some divine light, like, you know, Plato and Plotinus and the rest would want us to believe. No, poetry is awesome because it is literally a projection of what we are capable of, which isn't divine stuff, it's human stuff. It's not because we're reaching towards God, it's because we're this microcosm of God. Like, and that distinction's important, right? That distinction's incredibly important, like, because there are magnitudes of difference. And, like, that magnitude of difference is what Sidney is going to have fun with and play with and joke on. That's what's going to undercut all this. Jacopo Mazzoni made this very argument in Italy only a few years after the Apology was written. The object of poetic imitation is one that is consciously framed to fit the poet's intellectual needs. So the more autonomous the poet's idea becomes, however, the more insistent the need to attach it to something outside itself, you know, happens. And if a metaphysical foundation is lacking, then a practical and ethical application becomes all important. The function of poetry is to reform the will. So we have a very, you know, practical, pragmatic sort of, it's got to have this functional outcome. Since no learning is so good that which teacheth and moveth to virtue. Using a suggestive pun, Sidney writes, the poet doth draw the mind more effectually than any other art doth. So draw the mind as in draw you in, reel you in, but also draw the mind as in compose or recapitulate in artistic means. So that line itself already has double meaning, and both meanings are going at both ends of the argument, right? Draw you in as in the reader, the effect, or draw the mind,
expression
as in
inner work.
Which totally a priori, a posteriori. There he is doing it again in one sentence.
Yeah,
what a wizard.
Whew.
Yeah.
Whew.
The poet both depicts the mind and leads it to action. And this brings us to the second part of Sidney's theory, that poetry is justified not only by the brilliance of the idea, but the way it works in the world, bestowing a Cyrus upon the world to make many Cyruses. So it's not only just this recognition of intellectual superiority, it's like it actually has to have functional capacity, which, you know, this is all great and stuff, and I'm definitely pedestalizing Sidney a little bit, but you know, the dark side of that. What's the dark side of that? Propaganda, right? Like if poetry can get us to act a certain way, propaganda is the immediate, like, necessary next step. And that's something that you and I have been pitching pretty heavily, that Shakespeare's got to be, to some extent, a propagandic project. And I think a lot of other people are on board with that to greater or lesser extent, right? Like, I think most Oxfordians think that Oxford maybe is doing some of this for Queen Elizabeth and propagandic reasons.
Yeah, I don't think it's like, can they really tell me to what ultimate end and like whose lines and where and like who, what,
and you know, I think that's still really maybe being worked out, and I think they mostly pitch it with the histories, and you know, that's the Whitmanian argument that, like, yeah, look, we can look at all the plays, but the history is like, what, like that's deliberate, like, you know, mass propaganda, trying to, you know, mass programming, and like, I don't know, like, there is a lot to be worked out within the Oxfordian theory of that, but you know, at least kudos to them that they're willing to go that route. I don't know if they're willing to go as far as you or I, where we're saying maybe this whole giant propagandic funeral of Philip Sidney's that happens months and months after his death, maybe that's so propagandic that Philip Sidney never even died, but they needed that for the funeral and or him to do other propagandic stuff behind the scenes. And you know, if that's too anathema to you, just ignore it. Don't turn us off. We still got our work cut out for us to, you know, at least suggest, if not prove that. But John Dee's horoscope and that funeral, coincident with maybe stuff that looks like Sidney after Sidney's death and texts, that's enough for me to say, okay, wait, let me ask some questions. Okay. Sidney echoes the humanist rhetorical interpretation of poetry, and following Minterno's transference of Cicero's teach, delight, and move from the orator to the poet, he writes that poets imitate both to delight and teach, and to delight to move men to make that goodness in hand. So, like, yeah, you're teaching, but if you don't make it fun, if you don't make it entertaining, if you don't make people think and, you know,
applicable, you know,
then that teaching is just going to go right in one ear out the other. They're going to put it on the shelves. You have to make people want to recapitulate that teaching. So according to Paul Apers, this is the distinctive mark of Sidney's golden world. It is not a self-consistent heterocosm, a self-contained universe of discourse. Rather, Sidney stresses the didactic efficacy of the poet's moral exemplar. So, yeah, this isn't about creating some, you know, platonic other world. This is about bringing it into our world.
It remains too lofty. It remains too, you know, too divine. You know, it remains too,
Yeah, to go back to that, like, magnitude idea. Like, if it's up here, we can't do anything with it. We can just kind of look at it and be in awe.
Right, right.
But it's got to come down some to where, oh, boom, we're using it in the world, which I think that's a perfect way to maybe analogize the difference between Shakespeare and Lily. Lily's up here, man.
That's what I was about to say.
Lily's up here.
All that Spencer stuff, all that Lily stuff, it's just too high.
And to be fair, like Arcadia.
Yes, exactly.
You
it's
know?
all way too up there. But then you get some of the Shakespeare stuff, and it just feels way more relatable, way more, just more on the ground, more human based.
And, you know, to be fair, if I'm saying Arcadia's here and Shakespeare's here, then, you know, what the heck? How is Sidney Shakespeare? Well, like, if this is Sidney's whole, like, philosophy and idea, he may be working towards that, and chronologically it's going to start here,
right?
But it's going to end up somewhere around here.
Right.
it's an evolution. It's what the Marlovians say about Marlowe to Shakespeare. It's what a lot of Oxfordians say about Juvenilia versus later Shakespeare. There's an evolution. Hey, same thing can happen with Sidney. But if poetry makes a rhetorical address to the reader, it does so only in a way that conforms to Sidney's radical conception of the status of the poet's idea. So if poetry makes a rhetorical address to the reader, it does so only in a way that conforms to Sidney's radical conception of the status of the poet's idea, a way that Sidney defines by opposing poets to philosophers and historians. So, yeah, Lavao getting on Sidney's level for a second. Okay, so let's unpack that sentence. If poetry, writing fiction and poems, if that is making some sort of rhetorical agenda or approach to us, it's, according to Sidney, only doing so in the same way that Sidney conceives of the importance of the poet's idea, a way that says, look, this is the difference between philosophers and historians. So he's saying poetry is making the rhetorical address that Sidney says, yeah, that is actually the difference between philosophers and historians and poets. Like, it's this rhetorical address. And that rhetorical address itself is self-addressing. A philosopher claims that by teaching what virtue is, his discipline makes clear how it extendeth itself out of the limits of a man's own little world to the government of families and maintaining of public societies. According to Sidney, a philosopher never extends himself. He is trapped within the closed world of his fellow philosophers. So the philosopher teacheth, but he teacheth obscurely, so as the learned only can understand him. That is to say, he teacheth them that are already taught. And this is, one of the paradoxes that I continually come across in specifically this SAC thing, or Shakespeare authorship question scene, but, just in general, that, like, the people that I want to, tell my facts to that I've learned, a lot of those people already know those facts. And then the people that don't know those facts that I want to tell them, it's meaningless to them. It's obscure. It's nonsense. And so, like, what's this fine line in between? Like, how do I get the right, teaching approach for me? Well, you're in luck, Chance. There's this thing called defensive poetry.
How do I get the Goldilocks porridge temperature, right?
Yeah. This is too dense, but this is too light. How do I get the right thing for me? Enter Billy Mays pitching defensive poetry. Okay. So, a philosopher depends on others coming to him. Think about Socrates. He's always got these people just coming to him. And, maybe that's what the modern YouTuber is, in a sense. He's hoping, or she, or they, are hoping people come to them. Into his own exclusive world. While pretending to point out the limitations of philosophers, Sidney parodies the circularity of their discourse. Nay, truly, learned men have learnedly thought that where once reason hath so much overmastered passion as that the mind hath a free desire to do well, the inward light each mind hath in itself as is good as a philosopher's book. Seeing nature, we know it is well to do well. The learned learnedly discuss how it is well to do well, but their terms only point to themselves. Happy is that man who may understand them, and more happy that they can apply what he doth understand. So it's like, it's also exclusive. It's almost like this gatekeeping thing, and it's this thing that I've wondered about academia in general. Like, is the point of becoming an archaeology major just to be an archaeology teacher, to get other archaeology majors, or, fit in with what other, sort of niche, obscure science or, department? At this point, you could say the whole English literature department. It's just the point of teaching English literature so that other people can teach English literature. It's this circular thing. What's the point? Happy is the man that can understand the point of that. And maybe that in itself is a double-edged thing. Because, this may not be Sidney totally like, you dumb philosophers. Like, at some point, maybe Sidney sort of agrees with that. and this is double-edged. Like, on the one hand, it is a problem that they're too exclusive. On the other hand, like, what they're dealing with is totally this real thing. Once you get to this certain level of learnedness, how do you reach other people? That is tough. And, like, there can be, you know, elitism in art and philosophy, and it's a nasty part of the game, you know? So I don't know that this is Sidney totally disparaging that idea. This is him sort of saying, hey, this is the problem, and maybe poetry doesn't have to deal with that problem. The same charge reappears indirectly, if a bit more cruelly, during a later discussion of love. Some of my masters of the philosophers spent a good deal of their lamp oil in setting forth the excellency of it. Lamp oil suggests is all a philosopher usually spends in love. That's funny. A philosopher fails in teaching and seduction because his definitions lie dark before the imaginative and judging power, if they be not illuminated or figured forth by the speaking picture of poetry. So, yeah, just all of a sudden, if you add a little narrative or a little figurative language or a little metaphor, it's gonna pop. It's gonna pop. It's gonna stick in your brain. And at some point, like
that's where stuff like Nietzsche's Zarathustra has that sort of slight narrative.
That's by far his
you know?
most read book,
right? And specifically for that reason.
Yeah,
you know? It's probably why I like this book Cyclonopedia so much, because it is sort of just dense.
Yeah, it's just theorizing.
Tract, but there is a sort of like bizarre narrative that is sort of like, you know, there to sort of serve the story in a sense and sort of kind of keep you on track.
Yeah, same thing with Foucault's Pendulum too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Like that book's just dense theorizing, but like it wraps it in this narrative that okay, all of a sudden I'm a little more enticed, I'm a little more intrigued, and I can remember it better. And, and you know, that's where a lot of this is sort of going. Is you know, Sidney's whole theory of memory, which you know connects back to Ramus and Giordano Bruno and all that kind of stuff. But like a lot of his argument for why poetry is good. It's easier to remember than dry history. Dry history, you just got to memorize the facts. There's no mnemonic device. There's no other thing that's correlating to it. You know, it's akin to my buddy Ian's argument for why musicals are the best form of art. That it has that other extra layer to help you engage and memorize and you know appreciate and all that kind of stuff. Okay, poetry extends itself into the world in peculiar ways. As Sidney's argument with history makes clear, if philosophy gives us reason devoid of external application, history is caught in the external world, one devoid of any inherent rationality. The historian is bound to tell things as they were, and cannot be liberal of a perfect pattern. The historian, being captive to the truth of a foolish world, is many times a terror from well-doing, and an encouragement to unbridled wickedness. For see we not Miltiades rot in his fetters, the just Phocion and the accomplished Socrates put to death like traitors, the cruel Severus lived prosperously. Not only is the historian's world one of moral chaos, but in history, in recording it, lacks logical coherence. And I like this moral chaos in history because, you know, should bring to mind Macbeth, right? Like Macbeth, just all about, you know, moral chaos, and it's specifically, you know, people call it a tragedy, but it's a history play. It's from Holinshed. That's a history, you know? And so that's, I'm not going to say Sidney, but I will say Shakespeare kind of doing the same thing, showing a historical thing through poetry rather than Holinshed's.
They ramped up more of the poetry side, or at least particular angle of it, because, it's not like a English sort of thing with you get with the proper history plays.
Right.
It's like, this is definitely a history thing, but they kind of, it's a different angle that you sort of come away with this whole thing.
Yeah, and it's like, it's ramped up even more to think about the philosophy and all that kind of stuff, the example of history draweth no necessary consequence. And so the history follows the logic that because it rained yesterday, therefore it should rain today. The historian cannot understand the nature of examples and how the mind uses them. So if we go purely on dry history, it like necessitates this structure of cyclicalism. It necessitates this idea of that's what happened, so it must happen again. It's this inductive reasoning. It's the empirical fallacy is literally what that's called, which, shots fired at Bacon. And so that's the problem. If you want to base too much of life on observation, there's no point for change. It's what me and Ian talk about for the problem with movies about World War I or World War II or the Holocaust. I think that those are inherently almost impossible to pull off. Spoiler alert, guys, I don't think very highly of Saving Private Ryan. I don't think very highly of Schindler's List, because narratively they're screwed. There's no way to possibly show something that's that destructive and horrible, because either you're showing just this horrible thing that you're just slogging through this horror, or you have to candy coat it and paint it to make it look good. A similar thing with movies about slavery, right? Think about 12 Years a Slave. 12 Years a Slave, you're just going through the horrors of it. Is that doing any teaching? Yeah, maybe it's supposed to be a cautionary tale, but at the end, you're just sick to your stomach and you hate humanity. That's no good. That's not going to make you, it may make you change, but not for a good reason. It's making you change out of hate. But if you candy coat it, if you make it other than it was, you're just candy coating it, and you're telling lies, and that's not really the truth. And so, how do you navigate that line where you're still giving historical veracity and not telling straight up lies, but you're able to get past the brutality of it, the horrors of it, all the negativity of it? How do you spin it into something that can be made useful and good and purposeful and maybe even nice or happy sometimes, and so you can't do that with a Holocaust movie. Homeboy tried, the Italian filmmaker, called it Life is Beautiful, and it's about this dad and the son. They go to this summer camp. It's called Auschwitz or something, and he just tells the little kid jokes, and it's all about how seeing the light in the darkness. And it's like, are you fucking kidding me? That was the Holocaust. No, we're going full Eli Weasel Night, and bodies emaciated, ovens burning, terror, end of story. How else do you tell it? And so, just going on Sidney's, philosophy, maybe there's some way to navigate that, but good luck. I don't want to do it. Yeah, my bad. Digression over. But if he knows an example only informs a conjectured likelihood, and so go by reason, the poet doth so far exceed him, as he is to frame this example to that which is most reasonable. Where the historian is in his bare was, must tell events whereof he can yield no cause, or if he do, it must be poetical. Interesting. So they just have to put forward events, and as soon as they say, oh, this event caused that event, that's interpretive, right? Think about Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. He says, oh, because we have the geography of Asia and Europe totally in this, horizontal latitude, that's what's able to make them, technologically superior to other parts of the world, and thus, civilization and Western, heterodoxy comes out of this, gift of, and, maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but that's, an incredibly interpretive practice, and, Jared Diamond's maybe one of the most famous historians out there, and so it's we've gone from, that's not history, though, is it? History is, you literally just relate the events that happen, and the cause, that's an interpretive thing, and so, as soon as you put that in, that's poetical, and so we're already in the realm of poets. And so if the historians want to do that to make their history better, cool, but all of a sudden they're just doing the poet thing anyway. So don't really call it historians. So the poet knows that the mind must work through conjectures, and that examples can lead only to a conjectured likelihood. Thus the poet is freed from imitating things as they have been. The bear was, and is able to concentrate instead on the modes of understanding themselves, the lines of connection or consequence that the mind attempts to draw in making sense out of the world. And yeah, like making sense out of the world is like what all of us are trying to do with Shakespeare authorship question, right? That's going to be like a key phrase for us here, making sense out of the world. Because at the end of the day, Philip Sidney's going to want us to make sense out of this essay, because it's not going to make sense if you just read at face value. Examples in poetry are framed according to that which is most reasonable, not according to any external res or thing. It is of a small importance that the historian can boast of bringing us images of true matters, such as indeed were done, and not such as fantastically or falsely may be suggested to have been done. The historian knows better how this world goeth than how his own wit runneth. The poet, by contrast, having no law but wit, can frame examples into purified types of moral ideals. If the poet do his part aright, he will show you in Tantalus, Atreus, and such like nothing that is to be shunned, in Cyrus and Aeneas, Ulysses, each thing to be followed. The poet faces a brazen world, a foolish world of moral disorder that snares the historian in its senselessness, but delivers a golden world, another nature structured by reason. And I want to reiterate that, once again, earlier in the essay, Sidney makes all these claims and then sort of distances himself and qualifies it by saying, well, that's what the Greeks said, right? Well, remember that. Don't forget that happened, because at any point in time, that can happen in the rest of the essay, where he says all these things and it sounds all great, and he's like, oh yeah, but by the way, that's what these people thought. And so, real quick, to give it historical context, Stephen Gosson's essay that's attacking the theaters, who is that essay supposed to be, riling up and people are supposed to like it? Like, who is the demographic that's eating that essay up? It's the Puritans. The Puritans are the ones that are attacking the theater. They're the ones that are like, no, that has bad, nasty, no stuff, and they got boys dressing like girls and saying, swear words, and should sound familiar a little bit. And it's like, no, like, the Puritans are also who Sidney's writing for. While Gosson's like trying to, sort of just kind of appeal to a demographic, Sidney's trying to convert that demographic. And so this exact argument, maybe Sidney believes it, maybe he doesn't, but this is exactly what a Puritan needs to and wants to hear to accept the theater or accept poetry. And so Sidney's just doing like three-dimensional jujitsu while the rest of us are playing checkers, Sidney is often seen as a Platonist because this theme of reshaping the world echoes Neoplatonic claims, just as Sidney's idea does. Ficino writes, what then does the intellect seek if not to transform all things into itself by depicting all things in the intellect according to the nature of the intellect? Yep. The universe in a certain manner should become intellect. As in the first part of this theory, Sidney both advances the metaphysical claims and refuses to rely on them for protection. Is there any justification for the poet's inventions? It must lie in their didactic efficacy. So this is where Sidney does distance himself from the Platonic claims. We got to do all this for conceits, all this invention, but none of that's actually the proof of why poetry's great. Like, that's all just kind of cherry on top. If we want to actually look at the greatness of poetry, we got to go in the efficacy. What is the function? So if we look back to the idea Cyrus passage, we can see how insistently Sidney attempts to join his golden world and his didacticism in a bond of dialectical necessity. The poet's fiction, the delivering of the idea. And so, let's see, how much more we got of this? We're about halfway through. Yeah. Well, should we just make this a two-parter?
We could.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Just want to get to page 6?
Yeah.
Or you want to finish just one page?
This
will be page 6, so I guess just finish this page.
Yeah. Okay. And we can go a little further. A poet's effect on the world is as important to him as it is to the world he affects. It is the only way he can grant substance to his creations, the only way he can be sure that his poetry is not a sign of his estrangement. For Sidney suspects, as Daniel Barabaro and others did, that eloquent fantasies must be carefully directed to prevent the teacher of the many from becoming the frenzied and solitary builder of the castles in the air. Like, yeah, you have to stay grounded. You have to still be connected to the world, or else you're living in this solipsistic fantasy, right? And yeah, castles in the air should bring to mind Swift and Laputa and all that. Gulliver's Travels.
Oh, okay.
Hayao Miyazaki's Castle in the Sky.
Yeah.
Yeah. At crucial junctures in the Apology, where Sidney would have found a metaphysical argument most useful, we discover instead claims for didactic efficacy. Forrest Robinson, in keeping with his argument that the poet hath access to absolute patterns, suggests that the foreconceit is a pre-verbal mental diagram which, because of its participation in absolute truth, serves as a universal frame to ensure a uniform response in all readers. Wow.
What concept?
Yeah. Not going to unpack that one. Next. But when Sidney comes to discuss how this frame works, he simply tells us that when readers of poetry are looking but for fiction, they shall use the narration but as an imaginative ground plot of a profitable invention. Sidney does not claim that there is any true or universal idea embodied by or hidden in the ground plot. Invention carries its full ambiguity here, and we cannot tell whether readers come upon pre-established meaning or simply create their own. And so Sidney's already like prefiguring freaking new criticism. All we do know is that it ought to be profitable. We are not guaranteed a fixed unity between speaker and hearer. The most we can aim for is some ethical utility. A similar development appears in the all-important icastic fantastic opposition. As William Roski has shown, the fear of imaginative distortion was a powerful theme in Renaissance England, and English texts are filled with admonitions to control the imagination.
And I guess it's supposed to, I've seen some people will connect this to, yeah, this is the sort of heyday of the Protestant Reformation, and so you do have all the crazy stuff happening like in Munster and the John Van Leyden scene. So yeah, I think, yeah, Sidney's, when you're talking about the Puritans freaking out, like these are sort of the references that they're referring to.
Yeah.
Essentially, yeah, which is a whole crazy story.
Yeah, it's like... talk about power of imagination, like this is the era of the witch hunts.
Right.
Like people believe that crap. George Puttenham's Art of English Poetry relies heavily on the Platonic theme of controlling our representations by carefully fitting the mind to objective truth. Despite his earlier echo of Sidney that the poet contrives out of his own brain without any foreign copy or example, Puttenham insists that the orderly imagination must represent things according to their very truth. If otherwise, then doth it breed chimeras and monsters in man's imaginations, and not only in his imaginations, but also in his ordinary actions and life which ensues. The useful life must be illuminated with the brightest irradiations of knowledge, and of the verity and due proportion of things. Sidney, by contrast, avoids such Augustinian metaphysics. More decisively committed to poetic feigning, he welcomes the mind's ability to create such new forms, as never were in nature as the heroes, demigods, cyclops, chimeras, furies. He reduces the icastic fantastical dichotomy from a metaphysical to an ethical distinction. For I will not deny but that a man's wit may make poetry which should be ecstatic, which some learned have defined, figuring forth good things, to be fantastic, which doth contrariwise infect the fancy with unworthy objects. And just want to point out this word ecstatic, meaning figuring forth good things. That's a very Sidneyan concept, and you can kind of tell he's sort of aligning with it by calling them, by saying, which some learned, that little kind of ethical qualification maybe shows that Sidney does line a little more with that piece of the rhetoric. But figuring forth good things might be someone speaking good things or saying good things. Well, just to go back to another video of ours where I connect John Lilly with Philip Sidney, Eumenides is a important character in John Lilly's Endymion. Eumenides literally means in Greek to say good things. Someone who says good things. Someone who wishes good things. It literally means a well-wisher, which Eumenides goes to a well and makes a wish, and what a pun. Which, yes, Sidney's obsessed with puns, so Shakespeare, so's Lily, just pointing that out. But yeah, figuring forth good things. That's just a super Sidneyan concept that I always come back to. And
even getting back to the speaking breath and speaking words and magic words, and so like he's even saying like, yeah, arranging words has divine force. So I imagine, yeah, arranging good words, like if you want literal good things to happen, yeah, you should, literally arrange them. Try to speak good things.
Right,
good
right.
Intentions or good form, or take your pick. Or
I'm sorry, I mispronounced. That's not ecstatic. That's icastic. Which is that word icastic or icastic, as opposed to the fantastic.
Icastic.
And so he's basically saying you got to make that crap believable. Like once you get into the realm of the fantastic, and I say, oh, that's fantastical, it's no longer believable. It's not going to figure forth good things. There's no question here of approximating an image to an external model, of a faithful likeness being opposed to a mere semblance. For Sidney, as for Mazzoni, who actually placed the fantastic over the icastic, this approximation has become too restrictive. But instead of reversing the distinction, Sidney redefines it. Good and unworthy are purely ethical. Thomas Wright was to warn the English audience in 1605 that the distorted imagination putteth green spectacles before the eyes of the wit, to make it see nothing but green. What a phrase. But for Sidney, one can never take away the spectacles, which Sidney's like hundreds of years ahead of his time. That's like such a postmodern concept that folks like Derrida and Foucault and Lacan more than anybody, like there is no bare thing that you can take that doesn't have some preconception. Take away the mask, there's another mask. Take away the mask, there's another mask. Sidney's already doing this, guys. Like, what? Okay. All cognition implies some filtering or refraction. We can only hope to control the lenses we use. But what is this hope based on? As the preceding quotation admits, man's wit has made irresponsible poetry. Sidney hopes by this admission to answer those who see poetry as a corrupting influence. We should not say that poetry abuseth man's wit, but that man's wit abuseth poetry. Boom. So all of a sudden, this ethical argument that he's been building up, that like poetry's not some metaphysical argument, it's an ethical argument. Is it good for society or not? That's why we're all here, right? That's why Gosson wrote that essay. That's why these Puritans are pissed off. I'm going to tell you, this is why it's good for society. But he goes one step further and he's like, look, and the stuff that makes it bad for society, that's not poetry's fault. That's a bunch of idiots and bad writers' fault. That's not poetry. That's human nature. Are you gonna really get mad about human nature?
The whole thing, like, yeah, just because a man can, stab someone, or you're gonna, say that knives are bad. It's like, right. Knives can defend. They can cut your food. They can, obviously hunt. And
it reminds me of the ending of Ratatouille, where they're like, look, not all rats can cook, but maybe a rat can cook. I don't know what my point is with that one, but I don't even think that's what they said. But the part where Peter O'Toole's given the monologue, and shout out to Peter O'Toole. He's a Shakespearean. Also shares my birthday. Shared. Yeah, I digress. One more thought on that. Peter O'Toole would have been the best Macbeth on the planet had they done it when he was young. They didn't get Peter O'Toole to play Macbeth till he was like 50, and Peter O'Toole kind of things got rough in midlife and after. But had he done that, like Lawrence of Arabia days, oh my god, that would have been so good. If I make a time machine, it'll be like top 5 thing I'm gonna do.
Just get him just act as Macbeth.
Oh, that would have been so good. God dang it. I hope one of you agrees with me out there. Some critics, borrowing from the rhetorical tradition, argue that good poets must be morally good, but this only begs the question rather than answers it. So the problem with Sidney's double justification is that both sides are problematic. Sidney wants to make the kind of claims that traditionally have been supported by some metaphysics, but tries to make them without such support. The poetic idea, as we've seen, points to perfection only in pointing back to itself. It justifies itself only by repeating its own act of creation. So we get this recursive circularity already. The other side of the argument, the attempt to translate poetic effects into moral ones, faces similar dilemma. Wimsatt notes, Sidney, like most of those who have maintained that poetry is and ought to be moral, has not been able to resolve an ambiguity of the word ought as used in the formula. And is this a poetic ought, or is it in fact only a moral ought? In the second sense, ought to be moral is a tautology, since moral is what all our works ought to be. The easiest way out for Sidney would have been to repeat Boccaccio's claim for the unity of poetry and theology, or to claim some metaphysical universal at work, as did many who turned to Aristotle's ought into a moral term. As Sidney's argument stands, it comes close to telling us that poetry ought to be what it ought to be, and like the moral philosophers he parodies, Sidney finds his terms pointing back to themselves. So, like, just real quick, do you think Sidney's not aware of that? Like, no, he structured this entire essay himself. Of course he's highly aware of that. So what does that mean? Going back to maybe what we said at the start, he wants you to reevaluate history. He wants you to reevaluate the things that you learn, such as maybe reading this essay. So while you're reading it, he's recapitulating stuff you've already heard, theoretically, if you're somebody that's in the poetry at this time. You already know all those Aristotelian arguments. You know these Boccaccian arguments. You're sort of, maybe not exactly those arguments, but you know the whole gist of it, right? And like, Sidney's aware that his readers are going to know that gist, and he's pitching it to them as bait, because he's going to cut it back to make you say, wait a second, what the heck? What? And so maybe to refer to some of these other essays real quick, we're not going to go into them, but click on that second tab. This is a book called Dazzling Images, The Masks of Sir Philip Sidney, by Alan Hager. This is from 91, maybe? But his whole take is that Philip Sidney is constantly trying to get you in this state of dazzlement, where you're dazzled by paradoxes and contradictions.
Circles about your eyes.
And yeah, you just, and you're so enthralled by the apparent contradiction that's somehow still going and keeping weight within itself somehow, that you're just stuck, like, frozen, and like, what? Huh? What? How did he? Whoa! Like, that's,
It's Kubrickian,
Yeah, it's straight up Kubrickian. Yeah, it's The Shining.
Yeah.
And, like, that's Alan Hager's take on Sidney, and that's what Lavao's basically saying, too. If you click over the next link, we got Henninger, super big time Renaissance esoteric thinker, saying the same thing. Sidney speaking pictures and theater. Wow, wait, Sidney pictures theater? What the heck? Yeah, Henninger, who's maybe the updated version of Francis Yates.
He's the guy that we've quoted.
Yeah, Sweet Touches of Harmony.
Yeah.
Yep.
Turned to us by Soltron.
Yeah, Soltron. Shout out to Baconians. And so all of these are all getting at the same idea. This is Alwyn Thaler's Shakespeare and Sir Philip Sidney, The Influence of the Defense of Poetry, which we have a video on already. Thaler's kind of getting at the same thing, that Sidney has all these really cool ideas, but they may be nuanced, they may be contradictory, but that's what Shakespeare was latching on to. It's not that Shakespeare just thought, oh, these are better words than those other words. Like, maybe so, maybe not, but no, it's this, like, dense, enigmatic philosophy that Shakespeare's latching on to. And that, I don't know, at some point, it's incredibly experimental and playful philosophy, too. This is somebody that's playing with his food. he's toying with us, and he literally says it. He calls this essay a toy because he's toying with us. And he says, like, look, sorry for wasting your time with this toy of mine, but hopefully it's enlightened you a little bit. And as he does that, he sits there and undercuts himself. That's not just him trying to be modest. Oh, this little. That's not just sprezzatura. That's him undercutting all of these claims that he's made, because he does agree with that undercutting to an extent. We will continue with this in another video, guys, but this is, going on an hour and a half here, and we're only 2/3 of the way through this essay. So we will have to come back for the last part. And
you got through half of it, right?
Yeah. It's a little more than half, because those last 2 pages are gonna be notes.
Right.
So I think it's a 3-part essay. We hit part 3 here.
But yeah, so all the naysayers are the usual Philip Sidney naysayers. It's just, one, I'd really love it if I had some of Oxford's essays. I'll say it over and over again. It's nice that I can kind of be bewildered by Sidney and actually be like, wow, I can kind of connect, other than just a handful of random poetry or an intro here or there, a preface. And
right.
Maybe I haven't read that, to be fair, I could be, going off half-cocked here by trying not to compare, but it's like, I don't know, I feel like this is a lot more developed, a lot more sophisticated.
There's just a whole nother level. Because, I've read Puttenham, and I've read Oxford's, preface to Cardenio's Comfort. They're good. It's cool stuff, and it's, more Puttenham than the preface, but, they're getting at ideas of literature and cool stuff, and Puttenham does seem to agree a lot with Sidney on a lot of levels, but there's not that extra level. If there is an extra level, it's maybe more like, numerical encoding or that kind of stuff, if that is in there. There's not this whole rhetorical riddle that's being done. And yeah, I don't know, Sidney, like, it's somewhat a recent sort of understanding that this is all a rhetorical argument. This is all fashioned exactly like a classic Roman rhetorical argument that's in like the 6 or 8 parts. I forget how many parts. I'm not well versed on that. But yeah, this whole essay follows that exact sort of mode, and this isn't just some essay. This is a rhetorical argument, and rhetorical arguments in that time were very much like, you didn't necessarily have to believe the argument you were putting forth. You just had to win the argument. That was like a common thing that people did at school. Okay, here you have to take this argument. Go. So like for mental exercises or whatever, right? And like, let's remember Sidney's obsessed with mental exercises, but like at some point, this a lot of people are taking every claim that Sidney puts forward as Sidney's claim, and that he wholeheartedly believes that, totally ignoring the practice of how rhetorical arguments worked at that time. And so just keep that in mind, and that may help guide you. And maybe our video here isn't going to totally convince you, but please go check out these essays for yourself. Like, and if you don't, that's fine. If you don't ever want to look at Sidney, okay, but like, don't get mad when I don't agree with your take on Sidney, and don't get mad if I maybe belittle your take on Sidney, because you're not doing the homework to back up any sort of argument. So like, if you, I know a lot of you don't want to take the Sidney stuff seriously, but like, if you're gonna at all try and follow our line of thought, you got to start doing a little bit of homework, and it's okay if you don't. We'll keep doing it. We'll keep trying to get it to you piecemeal and digestible, bites, but this is dense stuff, and at some point Sidney tells you himself that, like, the philosophers, it only makes sense to the learned, and it's obscure to the rest. Well, this is looking pretty obscure to you. You're not learned enough. Profane wit alert. And I don't mean to be rude or shots fired, but it's in Sidney's essay itself. That's not me. That's Sidney saying that. So.
And hey, only the learned philosophers make it to the end of this video to
yeah, shout out if you're listening to this part.
And I just think Sidney's a fascinating literary character and rhetorician to get into. I think that if you're honestly just want to be
Yeah.
a robust
There-
literary
there's not-
philosophical person, yeah, you're not going to be...
Maybe Bacon, but honestly, even with Bacon, I don't know if there's a better Renaissance man than Sidney.
Yeah.
Like, he's just, to me, become the great Renaissance man, and at some point, maybe that's what the Shakespeare authors
Plus
are
he's a knight,
questions.
like, that's cool. Like,
Yeah, it is cool.
Yeah,
It is cool.
If you really want to, have that whole image to it, we got
Yeah.
it. But I guess we're gonna be edging towards signing off here for the evening. Thanks so much for staying towards the end of this. We love doing our Philip Sidney videos, so expect plenty more of this. And thank you so much to our new Patreon member. If you stuck around and heard your name here at the very end, Jason, our new sponsor. Thanks so much for joining. Super appreciate it. Looking forward to getting some interesting work out there for you.
Yep.
And to all the other viewers and commenters and naysayers, looking forward to see you out there in the comment board as usual. And let us know if there's anything that y'all want us to tackle next. Otherwise, we'll just be kind of meandering around as the information sort of takes us.
I'll definitely say that I'm on two things that are really one thing right now. May be able to get access to Prechter's book soon, and so can follow up on that Oxfordian group theory video that some people took umbrage at because I was critiquing Prechter only going on his free material, which is 70 to 100 pages on his website versus his 3,000 page book. That said, my critique isn't with all of his material. My critique is with his take on the Henslow era, the Henslow Diary era, mid to late 90s. I don't think Prechter's totally got that stuff figured out, and I will be coming up with hopefully a presentation at some point showing that, I'll go ahead and say it here, John Webster's the name that we should put on the cover of Measure for Measure, not William Shakespeare. I'll just say it like that and let it leave there as a cliffhanger. But I will be tying that back into Prechter and tying it into folks like Cyrus Hoy, Carol Chillington, Thomas Merriam. So a whole gang of folks. But I'm not gonna tippy-toe around this one because there's a lot of stuff that I'm not sure of, but I kind of have a gut feeling for it. No, this is something I'm sure of. John Webster is the author of Measure for Measure, so expect that come out maybe tomorrow, maybe 4 months from now, who knows.
As it usually goes.
Find me in the comments.
Yeah. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for sticking through to the end. Like, share, subscribe as always, and Nullius in Verba.